And all of a sudden, this conscience that had been dead so long began to awaken in me. The sin, the weight of the sin began to press down, and I became miserable, and I wanted to run from it. But instead, I ran to the cross. And that's where my life changed for eternity.
This is First Person, where this week you'll meet a remarkable woman whose early life led to prison, which she now says was the best thing that could have happened to her. Jennifer Smith now serves as the chaplain in the same prison where she once served time, and she'll explain how that all came about in a moment. I'm Wayne Shepherd. Welcome to our program. I appreciate you taking the time to listen as we meet someone new each week, someone whose life has been radically changed by the power of Jesus Christ. If you haven't heard, these interviews are also archived online at firstpersoninterview.com, but perhaps the easiest way to listen is to use our smartphone app, where you can download any program for on-demand listening whenever you have time. Look for the free download of the app when you visit your app store. Just search for First Person Interview. And before we begin, I want to thank the Far East Broadcasting Company for their support. The conversation you're about to hear took place during a conference sponsored by Revive Our Hearts, which took place recently in Indianapolis. During that busy conference, I asked our guest to join me backstage in the convention center to tell her story. Well, Jennifer, I heard you speak at True Woman, the conference put on by Nancy Namas-Wolgemuth and Revive Our Hearts. I know you have a very special relationship with Nancy and Revive Our Hearts, and they let a few men like me come to a conference called True Women. But thank you for sitting down to talk.
Oh, it's a privilege, and thank you for the opportunity.
Jennifer, tell me your story. Let's start with those early days of growing up. You grew up in Arkansas.
Right. I grew up in northwest Arkansas, about 30 minutes actually south of Branson. I was raised in a home with an older sibling, and my parents, they wanted to have one boy and one girl. That was their ideal family, and was actually told that I was supposed to have been, a boy. And when the day came that I was born and I was a girl, of course, they were disappointed, and they expressed that disappointment, not realizing what those words would eventually create in my heart. And it became a running joke of the family that, oh, God made a mistake when He gave you to us. You were supposed to have been a boy, and actually raised me as a tomboy, which caused me to be angry at my sister a lot because I was jealous of the relationship between my mother and her.
So it didn't turn out to be a joke for you, did it?
It did not turn out to be a joke for me.
Did your folks understand the pain that was putting you through?
They did not. It was years later. It was actually after my incarceration that, after I was saved, that as I began to go and try to reconcile that relationship, that I was able to sit down and share just different things and to go back. And I didn't really understand it, at the time. I just knew there was hurt there, and there was anger, and really not knowing what it stemmed from.
Yeah. So as you're growing up, though, you made some choices along the way. Were it because of this low self-esteem, or what was driving that? Low
self-esteem and just the anger that had began to foster and to grow and be nourished. Everything, I was a victim everywhere you looked. Everything, it was everybody else's fault. Why are they doing this to me? And so it gave me this entitlement that I could choose to treat people the way I wanted, or I could make these choices, because of what's happened to me and because of the circumstances or the lots in life that I had a right to be this way. I had a right to choose that. So, yes, early I began to choose drugs just as a means of coping, a means of, like I said, I heard the saying, this will make you feel better, to make things go away. So really searching everywhere that I needed this huge hole filled in my heart that only Christ could do, but not knowing that and searching everywhere else for that.
You didn't have that answer at that time. So did it make you kind of a tough person, tough girl?
Very, very. I, of course, I was, again, a tomboy, and I was tough. I was a bully, very rough around the edges, and the Lord had to do a lot of
This is all before Christ.
Yes,
so.
all before Christ, and just really did not even have mannerisms that were, or if there was no gentleness about me, there was nothing that was those feminine things that you would think about, because that was never fostered. I never had that relationship there with my mom, but it was just very raw,
How bad did it get for you?
It got pretty bad. There were times that, of course I left home at 15. just a lot of anger, a lot of bitterness at that point, and I couldn't listen to anyone. And it was to the point, there were times that I did want to die. I didn't want to live. And I thought if I did enough drugs that, one day I would just overdose and pass out, and never wake up again.
That was your answer.
And that was my answer. And so I searched again in the drug life, and with that drug life comes other problems and other issues and more sin. It just multiplies. And it just more misery and more misery on top of that.
So at some point you found yourself on the wrong side of the law, and
Yes.
that got you put into prison. I assume before prison there was other skirmishes and jail time maybe?
Yes, actually, I was 12 years old the very first time that
12?
I had an encounter with the law, and I had broken in a home and vandalized it, just to fit in with an older crowd, almost kind of a initiation type thing. But he was a cousin of mine, too. I knew him, so I thought, okay, balance that out, justify it, I can get away with it. But that was my first encounter with the law. And then at 16, I was busted for drugs, methamphetamines. And I was sentenced to a rehab to finish, instead of going to juvenile. Finished that, and then it was not long again at 17. I was arrested again.
It didn't work, huh?
Did not work. And then I was arrested a third time at 19 for drug charges and DUI. And, my parents were farmers in the area, so they knew a lot of people. So the justice system kind of just patted me on the hand. And I had a part in manipulating that, too. You don't love me if you don't get me out of this trouble, type thing. We do that. And
a lot of parents rescue a lot of kids, don't they?
Right. And they actually became an enabler and didn't realize it.
Yeah.
So.
But it got serious when you got sent to prison.
It got real serious when I got sent to prison.
What happened?
And I had, at this point, my life had just escalated probably it couldn't get no worse. I had been up for 27 days on a meth binge and had not slept or ate and was just making very poor decisions. And I can remember that time reflecting back and, there's a God, but he's just not personal to you. And I can remember just thinking, if you're there, I need some help. And I don't even know if I really voiced that, but just thinking that I may have voiced that. And, I never thought any more about that until the night I got arrested actually was for robbery and drugs. And I'll never forget when I was being pulled over and was being brought to the back of the vehicle and the gun's drawn on my head and they slammed me on the pavement and arrested me. That thought and that scene came back before my mind where I asked for that help. And I was thinking, I was not thinking about this kind of help.
Mm-hmm.
This is not what I'm referring to. But I knew at that moment, I didn't know what it was going to look like, but I had this peace that happened just because I knew life that I had lived up to that moment, it was going to be done.
Something was going to change.
It was going to change.
Mm-hmm.
And
you didn't know how
forced.
much it was going to change, though,
right.
did you?
I didn't know how much it was going to change.
So you go to prison. Had you seen that coming? I mean, did you ever imagine yourself in that situation?
Oh, well, I of course, couldn't see it, but everybody around me could see it. They were saying, you're going to end up in prison, you're going to end up in jail. Of course, that would just make me angrier. They didn't know what they were talking about. But no, I thought I was above the law and that I could always evade them and, untouchable, But no, I couldn't see it coming, but others could.
Where were you sent to prison?
I was sent to prison in Arkansas, in East Arkansas, at the Maximum Security Unit. It's called the McPherson Unit. There in Newport, Arkansas.
All right, that's going to come into play as this story unfolds here today. So remember McPherson.
Yes.
And it holds a very special place in your heart. What were those early days like in prison?
Well, the early days, of course, going in very fearful. I was young. I was just turned 22, and all I knew about prison was what you see on TV. Those are those events where you see people getting beat with locks or, shanked and just those things. And so I was very scared. So I did have a game plan, though. I had a game plan that if I go in and act crazy, people will leave me alone and it will isolate me. And so that was my plan. And I guess at 22, there was not much wisdom in that. But I did go in and try that. And I quickly found that there were crazier people than myself there.
They outplayed you.
They
huh?
outplayed me. So I had to take a step back. But those early days, that first year was hard time for me because I was still...
Define hard time.
Hard time is when you're still fighting the system. You're still fighting against God. You're still fighting against those that are even placed there in employment positions to help you get to a place where you can rehabilitate, and where you can make some sense out of your life and turn it into a different direction. Mm-hmm. And so that hard time was that I was still rebelling against the system, the authorities there, trying to find every loophole I could, get into to do what I wanted. and which caused me to, if you lose your class, then you don't get good jobs, and you end up just doing dead time where you're sitting around with an idle mind, and we know that that's the devil's playground, and so...
I know we're going to skip a lot here, but when did God come in the picture for you? And it happened in prison, right?
Right, it happened in prison. It was about a year into my sentence. And it takes about a year in prison for you to get real tired. That's one thing about sin. It will wear you down. It will wear you down fast. And even though I was in prison that whole year, and I had noticed these other ladies that were Christians in the prison, and I'd been watching their lives, and I had made fun of them on the side because you want to be in the in crowd, and that's what people did. But I was watching them at the same time, and they had a joy about them that was very haunting to me, but it was very drawing to me. It drew me in because I'd never seen that in anyone. And
you didn't tell anybody about this?
No, I did not tell anybody about it. I just observed. And so I observed, in those times where I was alone, in my cell at times, or I'd be on my bunk, and I would just be observing them, the way they responded to staff and other inmates, and even to myself when I treated them badly. They responded in a way that was gracious and loving and with joy, and I was just like, oh, this is not right. It's strange, And so that's the first time I had seen that in anybody, and it happened to be that it was on the inside of prison walls. That was the first time I seen Christ lived out.
So that was the beginning of the thought for you that maybe prison is a good thing for me.
Yes, and I would think, could that be me? Could that ever be my life? Could I ever get to that place where, I could have joy, and that I would have peace, and that I could be a loving, caring person, and because inside it's really not who I wanted to be. I really wanted friendships. I wanted those relationships that were healthy. I had no idea how to get those.
Interesting. How did Christ reach your heart then?
Well, it was actually through other inmates that began to share the gospel with me, and they began to invite me to come into this barracks there that was designated for this faith-based program to hear what the program was about and to participate in it. And so I did. I began to go in and I began to hear just different teachings. I began to hear the gospel for the first time in my entire life. I'd heard about God, but I've never heard this gospel that I was hearing that said, you can't do anything to get merit with me. The merit that you get is because of my son. He's the one that I said, well done, to, and that he went on the cross and he became he became sin, my sin, so that I could be made in his righteousness. And he took the wrath that was mine, that was owed to me, and he took that criminal's death. He died my death. And so I began to hear this gospel, and I began to see the word of God, and all of a sudden this conscience that had been dead so long began to awaken in me. And I began to realize, wait a minute, I'm a sinner. The sin, the weight of the sin began to press down, and I became miserable, and I wanted to run from it. But instead I ran to the cross. And that's where my life changed for eternity.
It did indeed. We'll continue talking with Jennifer Smith to hear her story on today's edition of First Person.
This is Ed Cannon, president of the Far East Broadcasting Company. FEBC partners with First Person to bring these interviews to you each week because we never tire of hearing how God moves on the hearts of people to accomplish His purpose. Whether in the hard-to-reach places of the world or right here at home, we serve a living God who leads men and women to do great things for Him. Learn more about FEBC at firstpersoninterview.com. Click on the FEBC banner.
Today, our interview is taking place at True Woman, a conference held annually by Nancy DeMoss Wolgemuth for Revive Our Hearts. And one of the speakers I heard earlier today was Jennifer Smith. And Jennifer, I was so taken with your story, I knew immediately I had to have you join us on First Person. So thank you for taking time to come by on this busy day here in this busy room and talk with us about how God has moved into your life.
Absolutely. Love to share the gospel.
When we left off a moment ago, you are in prison, you've come to Christ, you have repented of your sin, turned your life over to Jesus, but you're still in prison.
Right.
So pick up the story for me.
So after that day, and I gave my life to Christ, went to my cell, and just began to rehearse who I was and repent of that. And then that turned into a worship time that I'll never forget. a worship of then worshiping him for who he is. And so I was just excited. I was hungry. It was like a sponge. I wanted more. I wanted to know more. But though my life had been changed in an instant, I had went from a sinner to a saint, and the old had passed away, and all things had become new. My mind had not become new. And I had the memories of who I was and what I'd done and the choices that I had made, and those patterns were still in my life, that my go-to for choices, So I knew immediately that I had to get in the Word, and I had to get the Word into me, because that's what the Word of God says, that He credits transformation in Romans 12:2 to a renewed mind.
Boy, that's a turnaround.
Exactly.
From who you were
exactly.
to who you were becoming at that point.
Right.
Did people comment on that?
Oh yeah, they were blown away, and I think the first evidence to them and myself was I was willing to let someone else tell me what to do. I was willing to not be the final authority in my life, and willing to submit and surrender to leadership and guidance, and even the guidance of Scripture, but even to submit to one another, for correction and guidance.
Yeah. How long were you in that prison?
I was in that prison for 11 and a half years.
And when did you accept Christ on that journey of 11 and a half years?
After my first year in prison.
After the first year. So 10 plus years
10 plus
in
years.
prison as a disciple of the Lord.
Yes.
You were growing. You had to be growing during that time.
It was like a bubble. It was like a boot camp, spiritual boot camp bubble. I could say that the one thing the Lord desires to have with us is time. And He gave me 10 and a half years
of time.
it. Yes. And so I knew that I had an opportunity here before me that I could really take the time. I didn't have the distractions that we have out here, and those responsibilities. And that was a season that I needed and that He gifted me with, that I could sit at His feet for those 10 and a half years and learn His ways and begin to practice them right there, so that I would be prepared for that day that He opened that door and let me out in the free world.
Were you afraid of leaving prison at all?
I was afraid. It was different reasons for being afraid. One of the things that I think is the most common fears is, of course, returning to prison. That's always a fear, but it's how will I fit and where will I fit, after being gone all this long.
Yeah, what about your family? Were you reconciled to them in any way?
I was reconciled to them. In prison, as I began to get into the Word of God and I began to learn these different principles and practices, and one of the things that the Lord began to give me understanding and increase my understanding in was the principle of forgiveness, and how that forgiveness is not just between us and God, but it's between us and those around us as well.
It sounds so simple now, but it had to be very hard.
It was hard. It was a choice I made. It wasn't something I felt. It wasn't that I woke up the next morning and all of a sudden I had this love for my parents who had deeply hurt me, or this man that, had offended me in my youth, or anything like that. But I had this love for Christ. I wanted to please Him. I wanted to be more like Him. I wanted to experience more of the freedom that I was experiencing. And so it was a choice to obey that, I'm going to choose to forgive because He forgave me.
Yeah. Did they know what to do with that?
They did not know what to do with that. It was almost I had to train them how to, to accept that. But in my zeal, of course, the Lord tapered me, back some. But the first time when I called them, it was just silence, at the other end of the phone when I was asking their forgiveness. I didn't blame them for anything. I didn't bring up their faults. I took care of mine because I was very disrespectful to them, and I sinned against them greatly too. And so I wanted to cover that part, and I never mentioned what they had done to me. I let the Lord work in their heart, and it was at a visitation one day a couple years later that through tears they asked that forgiveness, and the Lord reconciled us, and they're my biggest cheerleaders today. So.
I have so many more questions I want to ask, but I want to get to the rest of the story, so to speak, here. And even while we speak, the conference is going on behind us here. But what you've told me is so amazing, how a person comes to Christ and the circumstances, and yours were unique, certainly. But then this story takes an incredible turn, because then you go back to prison, not as a prisoner, but as a chaplain.
Yes.
Did this come to your heart before you ever were released?
It did, actually. The Lord birthed this desire, not actually as a chaplain, but I wanted to give back. I was hungry to be able to serve in ministry somehow. And I knew this was a people group that I understood. It was a people group that I knew well. And I felt like if somehow I could be a part of of being a part of this. I thought it would be kind of on the outside.
This is your mission field.
Yes, it was my mission field.
Yeah. So how did you... what'd you do?
Well,
were they reticent to accept a former prisoner?
Actually, I became a clerk for the chaplain's office as an inmate. And so developed a relationship there with that department. And after you're out, actually, ADC has a policy. When you've been out for 2 years and you've not gotten any other trouble and you got good recommendations, you can start coming in as a volunteer. And so when that period came, I put in to come in and give my testimony as a volunteer. And the Lord just gave me favor with my authorities and those in the chaplain's office. And actually, they called me. I had been in Michigan, and they actually called me and asked me if I would come and consider being
back to Arkansas.
A chaplain, yes, at the women's unit there. And of course, my heart was saying yes, yes, yes. But I prayed and sought counsel, and it was clear that was the direction the Lord is still going in my life, and that was the calling and plan and purpose. That all these things that I went through up to that point, He used it for His good and for His glory.
Well, again, the story isn't ending there, because now you have a vision for sort of a halfway house. Is that what it's called? Right.
It's actually called a transition home, Cornerstone Transition Home. And this was actually birthed while I was an inmate, because I would see all these ladies returning to prison, and here I was waiting for 12 years to pass before I even had a chance to leave. And I would see these ladies that really had a life change, and the Lord changed. They gave and surrendered their lives to Christ over there, and they would leave, and then 6 months to a year later, they would walk back in the door.
Yeah.
And I was like, why are you coming back? What is missing out there? And they said, this. We don't have this. We went to church, and they didn't embrace us. And and there's two type of churches out there. There's a type of church that they're gonna. It's like the Pharisee and the tax collector that Nancy was referring to. You have those type of churches that's going to embrace this people group, and those that aren't. And so I began to see the need for that, and I asked them, "Why do you return? Why do you return?" They said, "We have no accountability. We have no support system. We don't have any help, and we go back to what's familiar." And so I thought, "There's got to be something. There's got to be something." And so years of praying about that, and the Lord connected me with a lady when I moved back from Michigan to Newport and became a chaplain that was working, teaching in the prison. And we began to pray together. She had a heart for this people group. We began to pray for over a year about this desire to open this home. And the Lord just began to, after that year, He began to orchestrate people, saying, "Hey, do y'all need this? Do y'all need that?" And we're like, "Well, yeah, we do need that," but we didn't know we needed it, but God knew we needed it. So,
Jennifer Smith, whose story is a powerful reminder of the power of Christ to change a heart. And if you want to learn more about Chaplain Smith and her ministry in that prison, including the step of faith to provide a transition home for women, please visit our website, firstpersoninterview.com. There you'll find links to all that Jennifer and those working with her are doing to minister to women in prison with such great results. Again, go to firstpersoninterview.com. Stories like we heard today are being repeated all over the world. The Far East Broadcasting Company knows that well, as it receives the testimony of millions, some of whom are also in prison, who respond to local language gospel broadcasts in nearly 50 hard-to-reach countries of the world. Take the time to learn more about FEBC at firstpersoninterview.com. Next week, as we prepare to celebrate Thanksgiving, we'll talk with historian Tracy McKenzie, who draws spiritual lessons from an accurate view of the first Thanksgiving. Now, with thanks to my friend and producer Joe Carlson, I'm Wayne Shepherd. Thanks for listening to First Person.